As Sharon said, I'm the manager of accommodations for the GED testing service and Pearson VUE. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So right now it's a great place to be because it's about 80 degrees and sunny. Don't come and see us in January when it's 20 below, but that has its positives as well. So today, let's see, I have to advance my slides here. There we go. Today we're going to talk about disability types, about testing accommodations, probably most importantly, how teachers and others can advocate for students who need accommodations on high stakes tests, how to process a request for accommodations, and then we're going to take a little time to review some incomplete requests just so that you get a flavor for what kinds of things could be missing and how you can help your candidates apply for accommodations for any sort of high stakes test. So let's start with what is an accommodation. It means the duty to accommodate, which means to ensure that people with disabilities can participate as fully as non-disabled people. Accommodation means making changes to the environment to ensure that there is a reduced negative effect because of a person's disabling condition. The goal of accommodations is to enable equitable participation. The purpose of accommodations is to provide candidates with full access to their test. However, accommodations are not a guarantee of improved performance or test completion. And we hear that a lot. If I just had a little more time, I could finish the test, or I know I could do better if I just had a little more time on the test. Well, likely we all would do better if we had a little more time on our tests, but the point of an accommodation is for people who have a true disabling condition and trying to level the playing field for them. Testing accommodations are individualized and considered on a case-by-case basis. So you might have two separate candidates, both with perhaps ADHD, but their accommodation approvals might look differently based on how their disabling condition presents and what their certifying professional says about them in the letters that they provide. All candidates requesting accommodations must provide appropriate documentation. Often we have candidates, particularly people who have been out of school for quite a while, say to us, I don't have any documentation, but when I was in school, I was a slow reader, or I know I had trouble with math, but I don't have any documentation. And that is a problem. You know, it's not that we don't believe the candidates, but we have to have some sort of documentation of that disability. So a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities, such as hearing, seeing, walking, reading, learning, working, and concentrating. Learning in general is a major life activity, but not all learning tasks are major life activities. For example, things that are not are spelling, test taking. We often have candidates say to us, and even professionals that will write to us and say that a candidate has test anxiety. When they get ready to take a test, they freeze up and they just can't take the test and they'd like extra time. Unfortunately, under the law, test taking is not considered a disabling condition. So we always go back to the candidate and say, if you have generalized anxiety, go back to your doctor and get them to document your generalized anxiety and how that impacts your major life activities. And then we can use that. But just the fact that someone has test-taking anxiety does not. So here's a few things that are not a disability. ESL. We frequently get requests from candidates who English is their second language. And for most of our exam sponsors, English as a second language, there are not accommodations for that. So under the ADA, having English as a second language is not a disabling condition. The other is slow learner, an active substance abuser, again, that test anxiety, and then some of those homemade diagnoses that people say, I have a spelling disorder. That's not a disability under the law. We categorize disabilities in 5 types. Intellectual disabilities are generally candidates who have an IQ of less than 70. Learning and other cognitive disabilities, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are ADHD candidates. Candidates with psychological and psychiatric disorders, or physical disorders and chronic health conditions. Now, that being said, if a candidate requests accommodations under one of those categories, let's say a learning disability, but when the review team looks at the documentation really shows that the candidate has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that doesn't mean we're going to incomplete or send that request back. We go ahead and we review it, even though it's on a learning disability form, we do it as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So the category isn't as important to us. It's the documentation that we're looking at. So we can look at whatever you submit. Commonly requested accommodations. This is one of the biggest questions I get when I go to conferences. So can I have a complete list of all of the accommodations that you have available on your tests? Well, unfortunately, number one, the list, if we could create such a list, it would be pages and pages and pages long. Plus, accommodations are changing on a daily basis. So we would just get a list created and then it would be outdated. So what I've provided here for you is just a list of commonly requested accommodations. Extra time. Many of our exam sponsors have time options of 25% extra time, 50%, and 100%. Other of our exam sponsors have different variations of time extensions, but those are the general ones. The next is extra stop the clock breaks. So candidates can ask for 5-minute break after 30 minutes of testing, or a 10-minute break after 45 minutes of testing. And sometimes those breaks are really important. A candidate, particularly with ADHD, yes, sometimes they do need extra time, but sometimes they just need to have that break. They can turn away from the computer, they can stand up and stretch, and then refocus themselves and get back to the test. Sometimes the breaks are really, really important. A separate room. Candidates with distractibility, a separate room is really important for them. Also, candidates who have other accommodations, like the next two, a reader and or a recorder, have to have a separate room because it would interfere with the rest of the test takers to have someone reading the test to the person next to them if they're taking the test. So if a candidate requests a reader but doesn't request a separate room, if they're approved for the reader, we go ahead and we approve that separate room for them as well. We just go in and do that for them so that they have that accommodation available to them as well. So a recorder and a scribe are the same thing. Candidates who need someone to input their answers to them. Most of our tests are on the computer at GED and Pearson VUE. So if someone has that accommodation, the person would sit next to them and sort of be running the computer, putting the answers in as the candidate is taking the test. Okay, accommodations versus accessibility. So an accommodation is a modification based on a disability. And those things we just talked about are accommodations: extra time, breaks, separate room. But more and more, we're talking about accessibility. And here at Pearson and GED, we're working toward making our tests accessible to everyone. So, for example, we have some universal access features that are available on the GED test and on some of our other exams as well. Um, and there are things like adjustable font. So a candidate, and that means anyone, can sit down at the computer and change the font up to a 20-point font that does not require any accommodation approval. It's available for everybody. So I know for myself, I've started, um, when I read books on my iPad, I've started bumping the font up just a little bit to make it a little more comfortable for me. So if I was taking this exam, I would be able to sit down and maybe type in a 14-point font just to make it a little easier for me to see. Highlighting is another tool. Candidates that have long passages to read, sometimes it just gets lost with all of that reading they have to do. But they have a highlighting tool, so as they go along, they can highlight parts of the passage. They can go back and read again before they answer their questions. And again, this is an always on feature. We call it always on, and it's available to all candidates, whether you have an accommodation or not. It does not require an accommodation approval. It's available when you sit down at the test center. And the third one is color contrast. There's a syndrome called Erlen syndrome, where it's been shown that some candidates benefit from having a different color scheme. And I saw this even when we had a paper and pencil test. Sometimes it really helped for the candidate to have a yellow screen overlay. It just helped calm down the print, because candidates would say the type is just sort of jumping on the page. Well, they found if they did a yellow overlay, some people use blue, it depends on what would work for your candidate. It makes them easier to read the material. So we have that built into the test. So the candidate, there's 11 color choices. The candidate can choose the color choice that they want. So they might want a yellow background with black print, or a black background with white print. There's blue options. Again, there's 11 options available for candidates to change what the screen looks like for them, to help them be um, able to read the test better. Again, all of those items are called always on, and that's how we're moving toward having an accessible test, as opposed to candidates having to ask for accommodations for some of these things. So, in other words, if a candidate has a mild vision impairment and they just need the font bumped up a little bit, up to 20-point font, they don't even have to ask for an accommodation anymore. They can just go to the test center and they'll have that feature available to them. And we're looking for more of those kinds of things that we can build into our test. Assistive technology, this world changes daily. Things that GED Testing Service and Pearson VUE have currently are Zoom text, which enlarges the font greatly. So if a candidate needs up to 20-point font, they would have that always on. If they need the print larger than 20 point, then they would do the Zoom text option. That does require an accommodation approval. Adaptive equipment. We have filing cabinets and shelves full of adaptive equipment. If candidates need adaptive equipment, we ship that out to the testing center that the candidate is going to test at. We do that free of charge to the candidate. The candidate uses it. It's there when they get there. They use it. And when they're done, the test center ships it back to us. So it says here special keyboards, trackball mice. Um, there's any number of items that are available that are adaptive equipment. There are some occasions where it is such a specialized item and tailored to a person that and if it will plug in and work on our computers, we have the candidate bring it with them. Um, we have to do a special approval to make that happen. But generally, things like ergonomic keyboards, trackball mice, we have those things in stock and we send those to the test centers for the candidates to use. Other screen reading technology is JAWS. JAWS is screen reading technology that the candidate can use to have the test read to them. Um, Currently in the GED test, that's just about ready. It's still in the final phases of development, but with some of our other tests on the Pearson side, JAWS is available now and the candidate can use that. So that's just some of the assistive technology that's available for candidates to use. Some current issues that are going on in the accommodation world is accommodation versus a fundamental alteration. We are always talking about that. Is what the candidate is asking for truly an accommodation, or is it something that's going to fundamentally alter what's being measured on the test? And a great example of that is a reader. If a candidate is taking some sort of a reading test, it's pretty much impossible to measure a candidate's reading ability if somebody reads the test to them. So that's what I mean by we're always looking at those things. Um, is it an accommodation that will allow access, or is it something that would fundamentally alter the test, like having a reader read a reading test? Accommodations versus security. Boy, this is a big item. We always have to keep in mind our test sponsors and the security of their testing material. Um, it's a tricky Dick Tracy world that we live in. I have a picture down here on the left-hand side of an Apple Watch, excuse me, an Apple Watch, even though it's a Minnie Mouse, it's an Apple Watch. Over here, that's on the left, over here on the right is an iPhone. Candidates today use either their Apple Watches or their iPhones, some of them, as a glucose monitoring system. But those items also can make photographs, they have Bluetooth capability. So there's a lot of security issues involved with these sorts of items. We have to always be really careful, and we work very closely with our security department when we have candidates who want to bring these sorts of items into the testing room with them. These would be accommodations. Um, this one on the right here, the iPhone and the Dexcom G5, the candidate's blood sugar is being monitored by their iPhone. Well, we certainly can't ask a candidate to leave that in their locker and be without their monitoring device when they're in a stressful situation taking a high stakes test. So we look for things that we can do to make that accessible for the candidate. Sometimes candidates have an ancillary handheld device that they can bring in and not have to bring their iPhone in. If that doesn't work, then we get security to sign off on allowing them to bring the iPhone into the room with some special conditions. And these are always accommodations, and they always require special security and work on the part of the team here, the accommodation approval team, to make sure that the number one important thing is the candidate experience and that the candidate is safe in the test. But it's also really important that we maintain the security of the exam. So those two things sometimes bump up against each other, and we have to be creative with the candidates to come up with um, solutions that will allow them to test and still monitor their um, physical condition that they have at the same time. So devices are changing. This Dexcom G5 is very new. It's something that we haven't had on the market very long, so we're working with that. Um, just when we get that all worked out, then there will be another new item. It's really interesting if you're not involved with this. Um, the world that we live in is moving very quickly. People now use their iPhone to control their hearing aids. So in the old day, you might have a handheld sensor that controlled the volume on your hearing aids. Anymore, the new technology is candidates would use their phone to control that. So, those are just a couple examples of the items that are new technology that we have to work with the candidate and the test sponsor to make sure that it works for both. This item harvesting is a really important issue for us. Um, None of our exam sponsors want their exam content to be leaked. In the world we live in with um, all the social media sites, if someone gets copies of test content, it's blasted around the world in just seconds. And so we are very, very vigilant about what candidates take into the testing room and making sure that we keep our tests secure, as well as the importance of the candidate experience. I'm going to stop here for a second. I do see there are some questions. If it's okay, I'm going to wait until the end, and I think we'll have plenty of time to address those and any other questions you have. But if you have questions, please be sure you're putting them in the question box, and I'll get to them at the end. So just a little update there. In 2015, the Department of Justice came out with a technical assistance document. There was a testing company that, and it was in the news, so many of you have probably seen this, but the Department of Justice did an investigation because there was a lot of complaints about this particular testing agency. And that brought about some changes in this technical assistance document that the DOJ created. And so just some highlights from that. And I do have the link here if you want to read the whole document when you get the slides, and Sharon will be putting them on the website. Feel free to look at this, but just some of the highlights for you. The DOJ said that determination of whether a person has a disability should not require extensive analysis. Any documentation requested by a testing entity to support testing accommodations must be reasonable and limited to the need. The impact on test takers' ability due to side effects of medication must be considered. Determination of what constitutes a substantial limitation to a major life activity is based on a comparison to most people in the general population. And a person with a history of academic success may still be a person with a disability who is entitled to testing accommodations under the ADA. So that's just the sort of the highlights of what this technical assistance document from the DOJ said. So just sort of our response to this at GED and Pearson VUE, we were, we were pretty much doing all of this anyway. We have a team of expert reviewers and external consultants. Our external consultants are PhD level psychologists from around the country. So if we have a candidate that appeals a decision, we send it out to one of them. They're a independent third party that doesn't have anything to do with GED or Pearson VUE, and they take then another look at the decision that was made and all of the documentation. We clearly post all of our documentation guidelines online. We review and consider all documentation provided. Remember before I said a candidate that submits a request under a learning disability could in fact be found to have ADHD. So we would never say, well, you applied as learning disability and there's not documentation to support your learning disability. We would be able to, if the documentation was there for ADHD, we would be able to approve based on the ADHD diagnosis that's embedded in the documentation that they provided. We provide written explanations to all test takers about incomplete and denied accommodation requests. And we provide training for internal and external reviewers. Here's just a picture of my team. This was taken for GED graduation day. GED had a virtual graduation day. And so this is my team. It's composed of a great number of different specialties. I have a former school psychologist. I have a former social worker. I have people that have worked in the disability field, and I have staff that have worked on our team in our call center, and they're the ones that do the help desk. So they have experience, call center experience, and they take the help desk calls that come in regarding accommodations. So it's a great team. You can see it's a small team. We work really, really hard. I have 2 people on vacation this week, so you can imagine the challenge trying to keep everything going. But everybody stepped up and we're not skipping a beat over here. So most importantly, how can you help your students? For any high stakes test your students are taking, encourage them to start the process early. At Pearson VUE and GED, accommodation requests or accommodation approvals are valid for a whole year. So even if you think your candidate isn't going to be ready to take a test for 6 months, it wouldn't hurt to start the process now. In case they need additional documentation, they'll have time to go back and get that from a doctor before they're ready to start taking the tests. Also, candidates, if they are approved and they get to that end of the 1-year mark, it's a simple process to request an accommodation extension for an additional year. The only time that might be challenged is if a candidate writes for an accommodation because they have a broken arm, and it's 6 or 8 months later, we would want new documentation from the doctor explaining why that arm isn't healed yet and why the candidate needs their accommodations to continue. But generally speaking, the requests can be extended for another year. Anyone can help a candidate with the paperwork. The candidate does not have to be out there on their own. Sometimes it's overwhelming to candidates, especially ones with disabling conditions, for them to figure out how to request accommodations for any sort of a high stakes test. But anybody can help them. And that goes with the next item, act as an advocate. You can certainly advocate for your student. On our exams, there is a place for the candidate to list an advocate or more than one advocate. So for example, a mom could be an advocate and a teacher, both for the same student. If you list yourself or someone else as the advocate, then we're able to speak to you or to that other person without asking for a signed release. So that makes it easy. Otherwise, if somebody calls in and we don't have a signed release for that person, then we have to send a release form. Candidate has to get their advocate to sign it, and they sign it and send it back to us. And there's just quite a delay there. So, you know, if you can be an advocate for your student, I think it really helps. We have a list of comfort aids. It's on the GED website and on the Pearson VUE website. A couple I'll call to your attention. A handheld, non-electronic magnifying glass. So if you have a person who would dial up to that 20-point font, but just needs it a little bit bigger than that or a little bit sharper than that, they could bring their handheld magnifying glass into the test and not have to apply for an accommodation to do that. Another is a pillow or a cushion. So if one of your candidates has a back issue or something that they need to have a cushion either on their back or maybe on their arm, that does not require an accommodation approval. But you can check out all of those items on our websites under Comfort Aid list. Another thing that we offer as just something to be helpful to candidates is our lower cost testing clinic list. 2 or 3 years ago, I had a summer intern that looked in all 50 states and in Canada and looked for testing centers, low-cost testing clinics that would be willing to do testing for candidates, usually psychoed testing, that would be free of charge or lower cost. We know that it's expensive for candidates to be tested, particularly for learning disabilities. And so we offer this just as a helpful tool to candidates. There won't be a lower cost testing clinic in every city for every candidate. Unfortunately, they're likely in bigger cities, but that list is available. And so hopefully some candidates find that helpful. And if they need a lower cost testing clinic, they can find it there. On that same subject of lower cost testing clinics or getting documentation for a disabling condition, there are other places that you can look. Department of Rehab Services sometimes can help with that, providing opportunities for candidates to get tested. Some candidates tell me that, or usually advocates actually tell me that they find that there are public service, community service agencies in their community that have helped with that in the past. You know, you have the Elk and the Lions and those types of organizations. Sometimes they're willing to help. I've known of churches that have helped their parishioners pay for testing to be done. So, those are just some, hopefully some helpful places that you can help your students find for getting the documentation that they need to be able to apply for accommodations. And again, you can find that lower cost testing clinic list at gedtestingservice.com/accommodations or on the Pearson VUE website as well. At GED and Pearson VUE, we have an online request system. The paper forms that we used to use are replaced with 6 easy steps. The greatest thing is that candidates now receive immediate feedback that their request for accommodation has been received. In the old days, candidates would fax it in, and I'm not sure where some of those requests went. I think they're circling the earth in this big mass of media that's circling around that didn't ever get to its intended location, but sometimes we didn't get them, and the candidate would wait 30 days or more and then reach out to us and say, I applied for accommodations and I haven't heard anything yet. And then we would have to tell them we hadn't received their request. So this new online system is great because they get immediate feedback. It's a secure environment, and they don't have to pay for faxing service anymore. Sometimes it costs $1 or $2 a page to fax things to us. If candidates still need to use paper forms, they're not comfortable with this online system, they certainly can use that as well. And the link is here for candidates to use. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time talking about incomplete documentation. So incomplete means that the application was not approved, but it was not denied either. There was just not enough information to either say yes or no, and those fall into the bucket called incomplete. So we have the top 10 list of why a request is incomplete. Sometimes the request form has not been filled out completely. There's missing pages from the request form or documentation. And these two things now have pretty much gone away when candidates submit their request through the online system. The online system won't let them go forward unless they've completed that. But for candidates who still choose to fax in, these can be an issue. If there's no supporting documentation, the online system won't submit their request for them. However, in the paper world, sometimes candidates still will send a request, but no supporting documentation. And all requests for accommodations do have to have some documentation with them. Number 4, the documentation is outdated. In our review world, we have general guidelines. We certainly make exceptions for this, but generally speaking, candidates who have a learning disability, the documentation needs to be within the last 5 years. Now, that being said, if it's 5.5 or 6 years old, we certainly are going to look at that as well. If it's 6 or 7 years old and there's an updated brief letter from a certifying professional, that helps a lot. For ADHD, the documentation needs to be within the last 3 years. And for psychological and for physical, the documentation needs to be within the last year. And again, within the last year, if it's been a year and a half or longer, but they have a brief update from their doctor saying their condition is, all it needs to say is the condition hasn't changed, we'll go ahead and process that. Sometimes the report from the evaluator is too brief. The test battery is incomplete. The test battery administered by the evaluator isn't appropriate, for example, using child-based norms with adults. The report sometimes includes no rationale for the requested accommodations. And sometimes the accommodation doesn't match. For example, asking for double time for a person that has trouble sustaining attention over time. We might go back and ask, do you think it might be better to have some extra time, but then to also have stop the clock breaks so you can refocus? And then sometimes the evaluator's credentials are unclear, or maybe the person may be unqualified, and you'll see that in a minute. So here's a few examples. This one is that the documentation is too brief. So this person is a pleasant 32-year-old female with medical problems, including bipolar disorder, and a learning disability primarily affecting her reading comprehension. Excuse me, please consider offering testing accommodations, including increased test time. Well, hopefully you can see the problem here is it's talking about a learning disability affecting her reading, but this is all we received is this brief letter. So we don't have any achievement scores, no IQ scores. We don't have anything to support the request for accommodations, no documentation of her reading disability. The next one, this letter is to document that Connie has a permanent disability diagnosis of attention deficit disorder. The family physician is just asking us to give all assistance we can to provide this individual, um, to help this individual with the test. So again, you can see here, letter from a doctor, but there's nothing to say, number one, what accommodations she needs, how long she's had attention deficit disorder, what would help her access the test. It's just too brief. So inappropriate or unclear requests, candidate sometimes asks for unlimited time or just extra time. When those things happen, we do not deny those requests. We send them back incomplete, or we call the candidate and say, you've asked for extra time. We need to talk with you about how much extra time you need. Then we have some things, candidate wants to take the test in their living room or have her mother do it. Of course, those things, test security is an issue there. When you're the mom, you just can't help but giving some clues to the student when they're taking the test. So the tests do have to be proctored by an uninvolved third party at the test center. And also, if we do have someone read the test or a recorder scribe, those costs are all borne by our testing services. Candidates never have to pay for any of those. So here's one that's inappropriate or unclear. Extra time for exams, doesn't say how much. Use of a note taker and ability to record class. Well, you likely can see where this has come from. It came from an IEP, and whoever the person was who recorded this information just wrote it, copied it off the IEP, not thinking about the use of a note taker and ability to record class not being appropriate for a high stakes exam. So we had to go back to the candidate and talk with them about this one. Sometimes the evaluator is unqualified, and we go back and say, no, we need documentation from a certified professional that is certified to diagnose what disability you say that you have. So here's an example. And a cardiologist certainly is a qualified doctor. However, almost without exception, cardiologists are not qualified to do attention deficit hyperactivity disorder diagnoses. So this cardiologist needed to refer this candidate to someone else to have this attention deficit diagnosis done. Then there are outer limits of accommodation. Sometimes it's so extreme that we just can't approve the accommodation. For example, 6 times the standard time. We sometimes get unlimited testing. The candidate would like unlimited testing time. All of the tests are normed, and they're normed based on the test being timed. So that would take the test validity totally out the door to have an untimed test or something like 6 times the standard time. Waiving a portion of the test. I just had one today where a candidate is having difficulty passing the math test. It's true, they do have a math disability, but instead of asking for accommodations like maybe extra time on the test, they're asking to have the math portion of the test waived. And it's not possible. Candidates do have to take all sections of all exams in order to get whatever credential it is that they're working toward. And then the accommodation can't jeopardize test security. So, for example, testing at home or administering medical care. We do allow, however, if a candidate has someone with them that needs to come in and do medical attention for them, we certainly can make that happen. But our testing staff cannot administer medical care to candidates. There's just too much liability to do that. But we can arrange to have a CNA or someone attend with a test taker if they have a severe medical condition and they need assistance during the test. Okay, we're up to questions. And it looks like there are many, many questions here, so I'm going to get to them the best that I can. The first one says, if a student is given supervised breaks and they are allowed to leave the room to go to the restroom, or are they supposed to stay in the room? The candidate, if they're given supervised breaks, they are allowed to leave the testing room to use the restroom. And we call them supervised breaks. So the other part of the question is, are we supposed to follow them around and supervise them? No, you just sign them out of the testing room. The candidate uses the restroom and then they come back. Next one is, we do not allow our students that are testing to bring devices such as cell phones, Fitbits, etc. Would this only be allowed to students with accommodations? Absolutely, Veronica. Thank you for asking that. Only students who have a documented accommodation would be allowed to bring any of those items into the testing room with them. That's right. Next question is about item harvesting. Yeah, they wanted me to explain that again. So item harvesting means that someone will go to a test and they'll steal test content, is the best way to put it. I guess in our world we call it item harvesting, but what it means is they're stealing test content and then they're putting it on a website for other people. Here's some of the answers to such and such an exam. That's what item harvesting means. Next question, Wanda asks, is there accommodation for older students that don't have documented disabilities but cannot complete testing in allotted time? No, Wanda, I'm sorry. There is not an accommodation per se that because you're old, you get to have accommodations. But that being said, that's a good opportunity for you to have a conversation with the student and find out if there's some underlying condition that could allow them to have accommodations. For example, are they taking some medications that might have side effects that cause them to be drowsy or cause them to have slower reactions? Things like that for candidates might be something that then you can get an accommodation for that, that sort of a thing. One of my favorite stories is a student that I was working with her and her mom, and we were trying so hard to find a way to get her extra time on the test. And one day when I was talking with the mom, she happened to mention to me something about the student only having one eye. Well, that had never been brought up in our conversations before. And I said, wait a minute, she only has one eye. So if you cover one of your eyes, you realize that your field of vision is impaired. And that would qualify for extra time on the test. Well, she, her daughter had only had one eye for a long time, and it just didn't occur to her that that could be considered a disabling condition. So there we had it. She got her extra time and she was able to take and pass her test. So sometimes I always, I call it thinking out of the box. If you think out of the box, sometimes you can find a way to help your candidate get accommodations. It might not be the path you were going on, but there might be something else, like maybe their medication effects. So thanks for that question. Next question, is color contrast available for the GED Ready test? It is not, but you can just go to a Word document and you can practice those in Word and put those different color contrasts on a piece of paper. You can't do it on the Ready test, but you can do it. You can practice that. The next one is, what specifically did I say about less than a 70 IQ? I said that there is a special form that we had for that. It's called an intellectual disability. Anyone who has a cognitive disability can certainly use the learning disability form. We had that form, intellectual disability. It doesn't get used very often, but that's all that means, is that generally candidates who have an IQ less than 70 can apply under that. We review it the same way we do the learning disability form. Okay, Peggy says, a student of mine has passed every section except math. He has a math IEP from high school. Is it possible to apply for math accommodations even though he's already passed other sections? Yes, great question, thanks. Even though candidates have passed 2 or 3 sections of the GED test, they certainly can apply for accommodations for that last module. Even if they've taken that module and haven't passed it, they can apply for accommodations for that. So you can apply for accommodations anytime. Next question, what accessibility or accommodations can be made for a challenged reader who has never been diagnosed or have an IEP? Well, Elizabeth, thanks for the question. All candidates have to have documentation of their disability. So if you want to write to me, my email address will be on the last page of the presentation, and maybe we can chat offline about this, because maybe there's some ways I can help you figure this out. But basically, everyone has to have documentation to be able to get accommodations. Are the always-on accommodations like font size available on the Ready? They are not. They're only available on the actual GED test. Sorry, I'm just reading here. Next one, Sandra says, many of my students had services for LD when they were in school, but have not been reassessed since. They are low income. There are no free or reduced cost evaluations in our town. How long is this designation valid for, and who would be the person to provide a letter for someone not currently receiving treatment? Again, Sandra, you might want to reach out to me separately and we can talk about this offline. Generally speaking, for LD, documentation is valid if it's within the last 5 years. I will say also, candidates with IEPs, not all IEPs are created equally. So sometimes candidates do have an IEP, but the IEP looks more like a transitional plan, and there isn't documentation from a psychoeducational report in there. So there's not enough information often, even in an IEP. If there isn't an IEP, we do accept it for at least 5 years, sometimes more than that. Maybe some brief updated testing might be all that your candidate needs, but please reach out to me and we can talk about that. Melissa asks, how do students request accommodations? So I am here representing the GED testing service in Pearson View today, And so I can say on our tests, particularly, I think most of the people in this audience would be people who have students taking the GED test. So the first step is for a candidate to complete an online file at GED.com. When the candidate does create their record there at GED.com, one of the questions they'll be asked is, do you need accommodations for your test? By checking yes to that box, they'll be led to the accommodations request system, and they'll be able to apply for accommodations. If the candidate has already completed that and has said no to accommodations in their file, they can go back in and under Edit My Profile, they can change their answer from no to yes. And then again, they'll be led to that online system. Melissa asked, do accommodations vary based on testing sites? No, accommodations are granted here at our headquarters in Minnesota, and they're for all candidates at all testing centers. So it doesn't matter where your candidates are, they would be allowed to have the same accommodations. Next question is, the accommodations for the official test and the practice test are two different accommodation systems. Actually, and thank you for that question. On the practice test, the accommodation that is available is extra time. And anyone can call in and order a GED ready test with extra time, 25, 50, or 100% extra time. That does not require an accommodation approval. So the only accommodations that require approval are accommodations on the official test. Accommodations, again, for the ready test, we just answered that. Ethel, if you can't find it, yes.
Hi, I'm sorry. We've come up at the close here of our webinar.
Okay.
I wondered if it might be possible or helpful for this group, we could circle back on the questions that we still had that were outstanding in the follow-up email. I can send to you the questions that are still out there that need to be answered, and we can send the responses when they send out the e-blast tomorrow, or even again at a later date if you want to follow up with people individually.
I would love to, yes. And if someone has a burning question, they can certainly email me.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So Debbie, thank you. You've done a terrific job. To our 238 participants, thank you for being on with us. And please know that we will be sending out the certificate of appreciation and participation, as well as the archive link for this webinar, which will include the PowerPoint as well. So from all of us here, we just want to say thank you. And thank you again, Debbie, for your time. You did a great job.
It was my pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye now.